What's on your radar today?
Well, Robbie, a decade ago, corporate lobbyists convinced the federal agency that handles rail safety to exclude hazardous compounds from its more stringent safety requirements. And last week, a 150-car train carrying flammable toxic chemicals derailed in Palestine, Ohio, creating a toxic air event that spit a plume of noxious gas 3,000 feet in the air. There's a clear connection between these events, but according to Media Matters, only 3% of coverage about the Ohio rail disaster discussed the rail industry's hand in the crisis. Major cable networks aired nearly 3 hours of coverage across 92 segments, according to Media Matters, with Fox News and MSNBC accounting for nearly 34% of coverage. And yet these journalists apparently had little curiosity about why incidents like these happen. Lucky for you, I'm a more curious type of gal. As The Lever has reported, a series of train derailments beginning about 10 years ago made people want to strengthen safety regulations. But Americans who were concerned about the dozens of deaths that accrued from these accidents were no match for railroad industry lobbyists. Norfolk Southern, the corporation behind the Ohio train derailment, ignored warnings that understaffing was exacerbating safety risks, at the same time that it paid millions to executives and spent billions on stock buybacks. They even shot down their own shareholders, who attempted to push through an initiative that could have required executives to assess, review, and mitigate risks of hazardous material transportation. Specifically, after a 2012 derailment in New Jersey that involved the same toxic chemical at issue in Ohio, the Obama administration proposed new safety regulations, but once again, corporate power won out, and the regulations that went into effect were narrowly tailored to focus on crude oil, excluding the types of chemicals involved in both the 2012 crash and the one in East Palestine. Cut forward to 2017, and the rail industry lobbyists managed to successfully get Senate Republicans to rescind part of a rule designed to improve braking systems. You see, regulators had wanted rail cars that carried hazardous, flammable materials to use an electric braking system that can stop trains faster than the typical air brakes. But Norfolk Southern's lobbying group argued that doing so would, quote, impose tremendous costs without providing offsetting safety benefits. One former senior official at the Federal Railroad Administration told The Lever that the electronic brake system really would have made all the difference. Quote, would ECP brakes have reduced the severity of this accident? Yes, said Stephen Dittmeyer. But rail companies don't want to spend the money. The Federal Railroad Administration estimated the brake requirement will cost about $500 million. The 2017 profits, by the way, were over $10.5 billion. But hey, I guess the $6 million they spent on GOP donations in 2017 was a cheaper bet than making our railways safer. Now that Biden's off the hook, he hasn't tried to reinstate the brake rule, despite being in office for 2 years with House and Senate majorities. And at what cost? 5 tank cars that derailed contained vinyl chloride, which vaporizes into phosgene when burned. Now, this is the same chemical that killed thousands of soldiers during the First World War. After the accident on February 3rd, thousands of residents on the Ohio-Pennsylvania border were ordered to evacuate. The scene was so cinematic, it was oddly evocative of a 2022 Don DeLillo adaptation, White Noise, in which a toxic air event in the Midwest forces the film's central family to evacuate. Even more eerie, the film was shot in East Palestine, and at least one of the men that had to evacuate was actually an extra in the movie. About 20 of the 150 rail cars were carrying hazardous toxins that are known carcinogens. And the EPA has reported that they are known to have been and continue to be released into the air, earth, and surface water. The EPA screened the air inside of 290 homes as of February 13th and said it had not found vinyl chloride or hydrogen chloride, which can both cause life-threatening respiratory problems. But thousands of fish and frogs were found dead in creeks around Columbiana County, up to 7.5 miles away. While evacuated residents were told it was safe to go home just days after the incident, some are skeptical, remembering that after 9/11, EPA head Christine Todd Whitman told New Yorkers that the air was safe, putting first responders in particular at risk. More than 37,000 exposed at Ground Zero since became sick, many with cancer or chronic respiratory disease. More than 1,100 have died. Meanwhile, a local reporter attempting to cover the crash was arrested last week after police claimed he interrupted the governor at a press conference about the crash. Get this, what happened was that because the press conference was delayed, it started at the same time the reporter, Evan Lambert, was scheduled to do a live shot. And because the live shot was allegedly disruptive to the press conference, he was arrested and charged with disorderly conduct and criminal trespassing. Big win for press freedom. Let's take a look at this arrest.
Stop this! Stop this! Stop!
For the record, his colleague at News Nation, Mike Ficara, who joined us here on Rising yesterday to discuss the derailment, told the New York Times that the live shot was conducted quietly and away from the podium where the governor was set to speak. He also clarified that Lambert wrapped his live shot as soon as he realized the governor was speaking because he also wanted to hear what public officials had to say. No matter, apparently, we live in a country where we throw reporters in jail at the slightest provocation and ask questions later. Now, Biden also has abandoned labor here. With the jailing of reporters and the success of corporate lobbying efforts, it's easy to forget that this is also fundamentally a labor story. Just 2 months ago, Joe Biden stepped in to stop a rail strike that rail workers hoped might bring them a single solitary sick day. Over the same time period during which the railroad industry was fighting safety measures, they were also slashing their workforce by nearly 30% and embracing a scheduling strategy known as precision scheduled railroading. Now, if you remember from our rail strike coverage, the scheduling strategy makes it very difficult for rail workers to be able to take any time off. But it also leads to an increase in accidents. Workers are sick, they're tired, and trains that are nearly 2 miles long are being staffed and checked for issues by just 2 rail workers. The train that crashed had a 3-man crew, an engineer, a conductor, and a conductor trainee. Cuts to staff and tight timing means cutbacks on car inspections, which may have led to the axle failure and need to rely on emergency brakes in Ohio. Again, not the new and efficient electric brakes, but the old air brake system. Thanks, again, lobbyists. While the new brake system activates on all the cars at once, the problem with the old brake system is that it operates kind of like a slinky sequentially down the line, and it causes the train to jackknife and derail when the brakes are activated suddenly. Candace Wagner, a freight rail conductor, member of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen Union based in Pittsburgh, and 2022 Socialist Workers Party candidate for governor of Pennsylvania, said, quote, "The rail bosses, backed by the federal government, refuse to address any safety or other substantive issues raised by rail workers through our unions in the recent negotiations. And their lust for profits, the railroad bosses are running increasingly long, heavy trains and pushing on rail workers smaller crews, arbitrary schedules, longer shifts, and more work than ever before. Massive cuts have been made in the operating crafts, car inspectors, mechanical and maintenance of workforces. All this leads to derailments like this." Honestly, what else is there to say? Look, stuff like this happens every day. Corporations like Norfolk Rail routinely externalize the risks of operating their dangerous businesses, from which they profit in the billions, onto the public. If they were ever made to pay for the messes they cause, maybe they'd invest in safety. Maybe it would be cheaper just to pay their workers and make sure that they were well rested and able to do their jobs. They drive trains slower and jump at the opportunity to install safer brakes. But these companies almost never have to pay, at least not as much as they actually owe. Courts routinely limit judgments decided by juries, and sometimes companies liquidate, get sold off, and then the new ownership simply claims the old company doesn't exist anymore, so they're not liable. No one is, even though they hold all of the assets and profits of the former company. After Texaco, Chevron was sued for dumping 18.5 billion gallons of toxic water in the Amazon, one of the world's greatest natural disasters. Lawyer Stephen Donziger helped lead a successful lawsuit against the company, securing $18 billion in damages. But Chevron has never paid a dime. It has spent $400 million in legal fees per year to fight the judgment, however. They also successfully got Donziger locked up on house arrest for 900 days, the longest misdemeanor charge ever recorded. And you want to guess how much they've spent cleaning up the rainforest? Well, just 1/10 of 1 year's legal fees. As long as it costs less for companies to have accidents and hurt the public than it does for them to invest in safety measures, they will continue to externalize the costs onto the vulnerable public. This is why it is in the public's interest for them to have to pay for the damages they cause. History shows that they tend to get away with murder, sometimes literally. The New Jersey crash from 2012, well, 23,000 gallons of vinyl chloride were released, but Conrail settled with affected town members for between $500 and $2,500 in exchange for an agreement not to sue. Details of the settlement were sealed by the courts. It was a working class community that was affected, just like in Ohio. And some local lawyers observed that the process of securing individual settlements was exploitative. I sincerely hope that no health issues emerge later in life for the people who sign their rights away. But if they do, we know it won't be enough. 23,000 gallons of vinyl chloride were spilled in the 2012 crash. That's a little under 200,000 pounds. Nearly 1 million pounds were on the East Palestine train. Low levels of the compound have already been found in the Ohio River, which feeds into the Mississippi, America's second largest river. How much will be enough to make the affected whole? How many are ultimately going to be affected? How will the affected ever be able to prove that this spill caused their cancer? How likely is it that Norfolk Southern will be liable? Who will pay the legal bills for all the affected low-income people involved? How much will it take to make corporations pick up the costs of their dangerous business practices? So many Americans saw the movie Erin Brockovich so many years ago, and from that and other films and maybe personal experience, understand how difficult it is in the legal context to prove causation. And that is precisely why so many companies that deal with toxic materials are able to get away with causing great untold harms. Because at the end of the day, the legal system, for reasons, not illegitimate reasons, really want to make sure that people aren't on the hook for things that they didn't do. At the same time, the nature of toxic exposure, the fact that it happens, the results of it are seen so many years later, the fact that we're all exposed to so many things, it's very hard to pin any one incident to any one outcome. And what that means at the end of the day is that corporations are off the hook and they have no incentive to ever really curb their dangerous behavior.
Well, especially if liability is artificially lowered by some kind of legal standard or statute. I was very influenced by hearing a talk from a law professor I really like years ago about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, where he said, well, why do they do this very risky, very dangerous drilling here? It's like, well, they're legally prohibited from doing it in many other places, and here their liability is capped. So you essentially incentivize risky behavior if you do that. So something, I don't know enough about the specific situation, but something similar might be going on here. Also, I mean, rail is a very cronyist kind of, I think this railroad is a duopoly essentially for the services it provides. So yeah, there's a lot to scrutinize here from many perspectives, I think.
Yeah, what's interesting, people should definitely go to The Lever and read the entirety of the reporting that was over there. But one of the things that I didn't include in the radar was that the rail company at one point was one of the biggest advocates for adopting the new electric brake system. And they were kind of touting that, we're the innovators here, you should use our rail, this is a great system. But for whatever reason, maybe they realized the cost of implementation just weren't worth it. They pivoted hard and spent so much money, and there's details about which congressmen took the most money from the railroad company, and of course they're the ones that are leading the charge against implementing these kind of safety regulations. It's a disaster that everyone could have seen coming from a mile away. And so many rail workers sounded the alarm. And it was part of the negotiations that were happening with the strike discourse at the end of last year. And now we're reaping not the benefits, but we're living with the consequences of inaction. And I think Biden and Buttigieg are facing some real legitimate criticism for not doing more. I'm
about halfway through that White Noise movie. I read the book in college. It was actually assigned to me in a literature class. I didn't really care for the book. I don't think I'm really caring for the movie. Although I'm not sure. I mostly remember the book. Is the lesson we're supposed to take away, and the connection is crazy. It was filmed near there, and there are people who are in the movie experiencing the same thing.
Wild.
Sounds like the kind of satire that the book itself is trying to capture. Well, I think it's ultimately right about people's irrational fears of death or something, because in the book it's not actually a harmful incident, but it makes them crazy. Oh, right?
I only saw the movie. I haven't read the book.
I don't know if the book
in the movie, it
echoes that
seemed like it
themes.
was legitimately toxic, but it was treated.
But they're toxic people anyway, or something.
I don't know. I didn't care for the movie. I don't know that I got the movie, to be honest.
All right.
I watched it for Adam Driver reasons. But yeah, we'll definitely have to keep following the story because the stuff isn't going anywhere.
More Rising right after this.